Hello, everyone. Welcome to another video conversation as a part of the follow-up to the Experience AI Summit we had earlier this year. Today, we are talking about how unlocking machine learning for the public sector. And we have a special guest with us today. It is Kanishka Agiwal. He's the head of AWS Service Lines, India, South Asia. Welcome, Kanish, to this conversation.
Thanks, Shivu. Thanks.
So before we get into the deep conversation, let me introduce Kanishka. He has been, as I said, he's a head AWS service lines, and he's focused on deep tech such as AI, ML, analytics, quantum computing, HPC, IoT, as well as specialty services such as database, storage, edge, hybrid cloud, and security. At AWS, Kanishka works with public sector, which is very interesting, especially central and state governments, on matters such as education, healthcare, non-profit, travel and transportations, and PSUs to drive AI at the scale for citizen impact. Now, he has worked extensively across global markets with significant stints in all geographies and major countries. In his previous stint, Kanishka led IBM's cognitive solutions, Watson, for the travel and transportation industry globally. He has held key positions around strategy, business development, solutions, and offerings, and oversee the conception, development, and take to market of industry solutions. Kanishka speaks regularly at industry conferences and trade bodies especially on areas such as AI, healthcare, travel and transportation. And he's an adjunct faculty at various business schools in the area of consulting, strategy, and communication. In addition to all this, he also serves on the board of advisors for startups in the area of financial service and healthcare. And he has a master's degree in business administration from SP Jain Institute of Management and Research, as well as a BTech in engineering from Ramaya Institute of Technology. So that's a very impressive profile, and I'm very happy to be having a conversation like this with you. It will be, I'm definitely sure I will be learning a lot from this conversation as well as the viewers. So let me ask you a question straight away. What makes you interested in this particular aspect? Where the governance and AI, how do you say, merge together?
Right. So I think I'll set the context on this, right? If you look at the way and the engine for India specifically, or for any country, the engine for growth is going to come from public sector. Sure, there are a lot of for-profit organizations that will drive, consumption, but at the base, in the terms of citizen delivery, in the terms of making services available for citizens at the most frictionless manner, it's all going to be via the public sector, the not-for-profit organizations, via government organizations, or entities, ministerial bodies. And what we're actually seeing, and especially in India, is that most government as well as not-for-profit sectors are beginning to now harness artificial intelligence. And they're now beginning to understand what is the scope, how can they actually use this in sectors like healthcare, education, social security, citizen services, or in just general, across the board for, say, the municipalities in various cities, or even using for analytics, like the way the Ministry of Statistics and Planning does, or Niti Aayog that it uses for planning out various long-term initiatives for the country. So we're beginning to see a huge explosion of how next-gen technology, and at the forefront of which is machine learning, come and drive a lot of consumption, a lot of positive behavior, efficiencies in the way governments actually interact with the citizens. And there is a reason why. If you look at traditionally how it went on, you had most of these departments in silos, and that's also because data was not shared. There was no central repository for this data to be there. Most projects ended up being standalone departmental projects. While it could be replicated, say, between one department to another department, it never actually happened. And let alone departments, if you look at even the state and the federal structure that India is in, even between the states, there was very little cross-pollination of ideas. How do you actually take one specific public distribution scheme that happened in one particular state to another state? You almost had to restart and recreate everything from scratch. And that's because data never existed. Today, we don't have that problem, or we're slowly beginning to solve that problem, where data is now accessible. It's all stored in a common repository. It's available for multiple agencies and bodies to take use of and build their applications on it. Some of the work that, for example, that is happening today as we speak, like the India Stack program that is being run, is purely around that. That how can you actually leverage a single platform that helps drive a marriage of multiple projects that leverage a similar data set to begin with. So with all of this in place, I think it's important to now understand why the government's really looking at deploying AI. And some of this is also, came great between COVID, as it is always said, right? That there could be decades when nothing happens, and there could be, in weeks, decades could happen. And that's what COVID has done in the last 9-10 months. The adoption of some of this technology, which we had hitherto thought that it couldn't happen, have actually seriously quadrupled. Look at the way the government is now trying to stay closer to the citizens. We knew chatbots. Obviously, there are a number of ways in which you communicate. So there's the email, there is the regular way of calling, but then chatbots are gaining a lot of traction right now in the market. If you look at the whole idea of not being in office or being contactless, then a chatbot comes very handy for anybody to get services or queries answered. And a number of organizations within the government have gone ahead and implemented it. So this is one way that they can stay very close to the citizens. The second is, how can you make decisions in a very fast and accurate time frame? Look at COVID and look at the entire contact tracing that has happened during COVID. Right? This is all infused by machine learning. The ability for you to know, hey, who did I come in contact with, and then appropriately messages or people are flagged by the control centers, by the municipal authorities to take further action. Now, that's a very important thing for you to, for the government agency or the healthcare practitioners to know. It is also interlinked then with the HIS, which is the Hospital Information Management Systems, who will then go ahead, pick up this data and drive further analytics, further machine learning on top of it, right? So it is bringing in a lot of accuracy and speed in decision making. This third is, how can you strengthen your safety and security? Again, going back to COVID, and this is something that was very close to our heart. At AWS, we had a partnership with the Drone Federation of India, and at some point in time in May, I remember the Drone Federation of India came to me and said, we want to go ahead and see if drones can be used to just see whether people are actually stepping out of their house when they shouldn't be, if it was a containment zone, or are they maintaining that necessary distance of 6 feet. And Bihar Police, for example, actually went ahead and put out drones in multiple localities where these drones would fly across lanes and just see if people are staying indoors or are they maintaining the relevant gap between that social distancing that should be maintained. Again, something that is a great ML problem statement that was used for a real-time solution. They went ahead, Tamil Nadu, for example, used this to just geofence people in a hospital to know whether you should be moving from one place to another if you were, COVID struck. And then, the next pieces that start coming in are all around operational efficiencies, lower costs. A lot of people think that when you go ahead and employ machine learning, this is going to increase my cost. It's actually not. It's going to go ahead and drop costs, bring in efficiency into your supply chain or your processes. And more importantly, you can have people who were earlier looking at documents and approving them, reading through them. Why not just use a machine learning algorithm to read through those documents, extract that information, look at those fields, approve or disapprove the file appropriately, or provide the necessary recommendation to the officer in charge. And he then takes a decision on it. And he can then use that time for something else that is a lot more of value to him, value to the citizens, value to the department that he's serving. So again, a lot of operational efficiency and costs that can come down because of using machine learning. And finally, at the base of it, right, is all of the research and innovation that can take place. Today, if you look at most of the research and innovation that is taking place at institutes of higher research, fundamental research at the IITs, ISCs, etc., are all around the machine learning space. That's where they are looking at how can I bring in revolutionary ideas? How can I look at use cases that can actually scale up and stop being pilots? Right? It's very important. I'll speak about it a little more. Is that we want to make sure that there are real world cases that can be solved. Can I look at a CCTV footage just to know the vehicle number and appropriately take action on it? Why do I need to have somebody in the control room looking for violations? Can this be used appropriately? Can I use, for example, drones that I was speaking about? Can it be used for surveying, aerial surveying of farmland? Can I put that out again, a research project? Can I issue crop advisory to our farmers using something like the satellite data or the telemetry data? So, clearly, I know it's a long-winded answer, Jibu, what you asked for. But this is where we think the marriage of public sector and next-gen technology like machine learning can come in and drive a much more seamless citizen delivery of services.
I really love the way you approach the whole situation. Even I agree with all of the points you mentioned, especially the way many of the state governments as well as central entities used technologies like ML and data analytics for the COVID purposes. And I think Andrew NG as well as Satya Nadella famously pointed out that in the first 2 months of lockdown, we had a digital transformation that in 2 months we could see in like 2 years, which would have normally taken 2 years. So COVID had pretty much acted as a catalyst in one way for this transformation towards more data-oriented services. And I mean, like you pointed out, the drone part also. I mean, the Gerida Aerospace. I think the folks who worked on Tamil Nadu, they did a great job. And similarly, Drona Maps was doing an analytic job in Rajasthan as well. Another incredible startup. And one point I keep wondering, these mentioning about data and the silos, right? Don't you think we are still in that phase where many of our data are still kept in silos? I mean, that's one thing that we come across again and again, right? I mean, we are rich in data. I mean, unlike any other country, India has, like Minister Ravi Shankar Prasad point, we are data rich. And data is our raw material. But how do you break down these silos? How do we get best out of them? I'm talking about a public sector point of view.
Correct. See, and again, I'm going to split this. That this is not a single problem, right? This is not a problem in isolation. So it needs to be what we call as how can you go ahead and use data, use all that is at your disposal to build out what is an efficient machine learning strategy in place, right? So yes, data is a part of the strategy. The use cases are a part of the strategy. Making sure your teams are upskilled is a part of your strategy, right? So there are multiple areas that we see here, and I'll break it down in a couple of pieces. The first one that you want to first ensure before we even start collecting data, before we even start understanding, hey, how do I get a common use for this database? How do I make sure that I'm capturing all the fields that are needed? Am I capturing too much, too little? It's more important that do you first have a machine learning culture built into the various public sector organizations that you're looking at? And that culture is to be driven from top. If you collect garbage, you will get garbage.
So, of course, garbage in, garbage out.
So if your top leadership is aligned and says, well, I want you to be focused on solving a particular problem, then the next parts of it, which is how do I solve the problem? What data do I need to do? How much is the right way to solve this problem? Then all starts coming in place. It's also important that this is not looked as something which is, novelty. It is fancy, it is the flavor of the season, and therefore we are going ahead with machine learning. But it's more important to say, is this a sustainable machine learning culture that we're building within the organization? Are we re-engineering everything for the sake of machine learning, or are we doing this because we see some very specific machine learning problems coming in? Right. So it's also what we call as democratize a little bit of your machine learning, if you may say so. The second is then coming to your data strategy itself. What data do you want to collect? Which fields are right to be collected? At this point in time, if you really ask me, no data collection is enough. There can be always scope for collecting more data, running more insights on it, running more personalization on it, and so on and so forth. I mean, look at what we do at Amazon, right? Within the Amazon consumer business, there is a lot of data that is collected which helps personalize offerings to you, personalize your buying behavior, future recommendations for us to know when you'll reach a particular destination, a parcel reaching a particular destination. Again, these are data points that we're getting. We're getting data points from, hey, when is the flight supposed to take off? What is the typical traffic latency that may happen? How big is the parcel, and so on and so forth. So all of that can come in and feed into the database to then put out what should be my end result out of it. So clearly, before getting into what is the problem, what is the data we need, I need the problem statement. And that takes me, what is the right business problem I'm trying to solve? Is the business problem a very utopian business problem, or is it a very simple business problem that requires just 2 or 3 clicks and I'm done? I'll give you an example. In fact, this is fantastic. An organization we work very closely with, Wadhwani AI, and you probably have heard of it, right?
Of course.
AI does a lot of work. They're a not-for-profit organization. They do a ton of work in the agriculture and healthcare space. And if you look at the problem statements that they're trying to solve, you'd pretty much snap your fingers and say, aha, I know what you're trying to get, but this is actually pretty simple. But the science behind it and the overall implementation behind it can be pretty complex. One of the solutions that they do is something called infant anthropometry, right?
Yes, I'm familiar with that. Yeah.
You're familiar with that, right? And
yes. And they have done so many incredible things in the last few years, especially the cotton farmers one, as well as this infant one. Yes.
Absolutely. So for people who are listening in, right? I mean, what they did was you had ASHA workers, which is your frontline healthline workers, who used to go into these villages or remote areas, and the way to know whether a child is malnourished or overweight was you put it on a precarious spring balance and then weigh the child. And most ASHA workers would then go ahead and plug in a particular value, and a value was given by the World Health Organization, whether this person was above or below. And they found that a number of people actually used to plug in the same value, which meant either the right reading wasn't done, or it meant that a number of spring balances didn't have the necessary way to put it in. What they did was they said, well, we'll put up an application on your phone. All you needed to do was take a picture of that baby. Once you took the picture of the baby, there's a very clear maths that typically babies and humans, but babies more particular, are 70% water, 30% mass. You could just straight away do that calculation, make a 3D model out of it, and come to a weight for that baby that can be easily fed into the register, possibly also linked back to the healthcare databases, so on and so forth. Again, if you look at it, the problem statement and the way to execute that problem statement are two different things. The execution is extremely simple. All they needed to do was take a picture. So the ASHA worker, they used to take the phone and take a picture of it and process it. But the eventual implementation required a ton of data to be collected. The deep understanding of how a baby's body is typically built and so on and so forth, right? And then putting all of that together, build a 3D model, know how much input, how much weight is that body going to weigh, and then plug this back into the databases. That is where they got it right, which is they knew exactly the business problem to solve, had the least amount of friction to get this solved, and then knew how much data that they needed. And what then meant was they went ahead, scaled this beyond a pilot project. So again, it's very important that when you do all of these, you want to make sure that it goes beyond pilot. There's no fun in doing an academic project for proving a particular hypothesis, but it's more important how do you see scale and government projects. Projects, right? So that's the way we look at how do we have the data strategy.
So you mentioned Wadhwani's project. I mean, they have been doing so many incredible work. Similarly, there are some other organizations also. For example, Cropin has been working closely with farmers, especially with crop insurance. And then you have Interlaw Labs, which work with the quality assaying projects. And I mean, there have been, I think, like you pointed, last 2 years has been exciting in terms of many problems. The problems these entrepreneurs and the government identified, and they are trying to solve. Because if I'm correct, Hyderabad actually employed the city employed a technology where they are now using the video analytics to recognize if somebody is wearing a mask or not. So in a way, there are these, Tamil Nadu is using AI to help with the clean drinking water initiative. So I think we reached a point where the governments are actually, whether state or central, are aware of the potential and why, like the need to embrace this technology. But on the other side, there is this question which you brought up. How do we go from a like a paper? You can write a paper. For example, that I have seen many cases of studies coming across, whether across Nature or Springer or Lancet, keep coming up. We have found out a way where we can identify COVID very cheaply, easily. But these are basically, as we all know, based on a sets that are such, very standardized, of high quality. Let's say something like looking at a chest X-ray and detecting COVID, right? These X-rays were perfectly done, of high quality, and yeah, it will be good enough, good to write a paper on it. But as you said about the ASHA workers, as you said about the circumstance in the real world, you won't get the correct X-rays. It will be skewed. It will be faded. So that's a challenge, right? How do we take something like this and how do we expand it? How do we encourage, as well as how do we implement all this incredible projects that are happening into a large production settings? What are the challenges that's holding this back?
And actually, this is this is a very loaded question, right? So, and it probably will require a very loaded answer as well. I think, if you look at the typical way that machine learning has to scale, and there are barriers to it. There are ways, there are what they call as those steeplechases that it needs to go through to make sure that something comes up at scale and something is not just of academic interest or something is just a utopian use case somebody put out and it's too far-fetched for you to even solve. And that's why I go back to my very first statement that I made when I started off. I said that we want to make sure that machine learning is democratized as much as possible, first. And there is a reason why we call that it has to be democratized. First and most foremost, people must be able to understand what are you trying to do with machine learning. And that's when you will have a bit of a culture change coming in, people accepting why this should be put out in place in the first place. Because, general tendency, people tend to have silos, data silos, departmental silos, and so on and so forth, right? So how can you make sure that you are able to drive ML very seamlessly across the entire process chain? I mean, just take a loan disbursement, for example, and there are multiple organizations that do it. In fact, one of the organizations, and this is outside of India, there is an organization called Cabbage. And Cabbage, what they used to do is they are a data processing and small and medium businesses loan disbursement company. During COVID, obviously, there are a number of small and medium businesses that needed loans and can't get into their premises, can't provide documents, can't give any kind of physical documents. What Cabbage did was it went ahead and streamlined the entire process and infused it with ML at each point in time, with it being completely beneath the layer where an average person who was actually processing that loan didn't know that there was ML coming. So if you fed your document in, it would read the document, it would take out the bank entries out of it, it would know which organization you are, so on and so forth. So it would take all of those entities, put that into a database. Then it would go put a risk score to it. It would go ahead and look at your 401k returns or any of those pieces around it. It would then go ahead and put out a overall amount that could be sanctioned out of it, and then disperse that across. What they did was a very frictionless way of dispersing loans, and we're beginning to see a number of this in some small spaces, even in India, right? So, for example, the Common Services Center, they're now beginning to use some of ML to look at all the documents that come in from citizen services. So from citizens to actually read them and extract information from that, put it into a database, which earlier somebody used to put their hands on a keyboard and actually type it down. It's taking all that out, and people are able to now understand that, well, this is what is machine learning, whether you call it AI, ML, and that's, I will leave the semantics away, but people are beginning to now use that time to do something else. Right? So yes. That is the first part. The second is, how do you make sure that your workers and people who use ML are upskilled? There is a study, and this has come off World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum actually tells you that there are going to be about 58 million AI jobs in the next few years. We currently have only about 300,000 AI professionals. Now, obviously, these professionals are not going to, and this is worldwide. I mean, the India numbers are going to be smaller. Right? So clearly, these are not the people that will be able to scale up to the demand that is there. What you'll have to do is go ahead, upskill, reskill, and again, re-baseline a lot of workforce right now on ML. The only way you can do that is have very targeted programs that will help you get these people reskilled on machine learning. At Amazon, for example, and we're not the only ones, right? There are a number of organizations that do it. Morningstar does it, DBS does it. Globally, there are a number of these organizations that do it. But at Amazon, we did something very profound over the last several years. 10 years back, we actually went back to every department and told them that what is your machine learning strategy and how do you plan to change certain processes in your department using machine learning? And hearing a no was not an answer. We had to, somebody, the department heads had to come back with what processes they are going to infuse with machine learning. More importantly, what is the plan to skill workforce on machine learning? We ran a machine learning university. We still run it for a number of our workforce to be skilled, reskilled on it, and it continues to be one of our top areas. And that's the reason why you see both at AWS and also at Amazon that the number of processes and the research that has gone in machine learning, right from the way you buy to the point where how you consume an AWS service or any of the services that you see today that are coming out. In fact, you would have heard some of the announcements in recent times at our conferences are all geared on how do you make machine learning as easily accessible to your workforce. Right. So that's the second piece. The third is, and this is where you is very important, which you put out, right? How do you bring trust in those products? How do you make sure that once somebody actually uses it, they are skilled on it, the end customer goes ahead and uses these machine learning or is good with the machine learning? You clearly spoke about the MRI scans, the CT scans that can happen, the bias that can creep in feeding certain MRI scans versus another, right? I'm going to give you a very interesting anecdote on this. I was speaking to somebody from the army, and they told us that, look, we want you to do voice recognition for a number of things that are told by our soldiers on the field and come back to us by just transcribing what has been said. And if you look at it on the face of it, it seems a very easy problem, right? Because voice transcription is being done for many years right now. But then suddenly he introduced a different parameter to that. He said, look, our voice samples are going to be very, very noisy. These soldiers are going to be in a battlefield. There's going to be a helicopter on top. There's going to be bullets whizzing around and so on and so forth. So you're going to get a very noisy sample before you can even churn this out into a transcript. Now, suddenly the problem statement went up 10x. It's no longer my traditional transcription problem. It required a lot of detailing before we could even go ahead and move on. So, that trust of whether you should use this technology to solve everything or is this going to be a destructive technology is obviously going to be there. What is important is to gain faith in machine learning products. You need to have a diverse workforce that builds them out. You need to have people coming from various gender, race, caste, creed, religion, economic, socio-economic background to actually build this out. And what this does is two problems. First, it gives diverse perspectives when you build the machine learning algorithm out or machine learning solution out. And secondly, it is also able to get more acceptability by the same set of people that have actually built it, because you now know that it is scrubbed of the bias that could be if you and I, let's say, went ahead and built that system out. And third, you would want it to be absolutely tested against third-party benchmarks. And it's not good enough to just say, hey, my machine learning product is great. Can I actually benchmark it against third-party benchmarks that are out there, which are either developed by the academia in conjunction with the government, or it could be maybe some other, non-aligned industry bodies that can actually put this out, and that becomes a clear area for us to get results and benchmark what we have told. Right. So that's my third piece. And finally, what we call as once you've got the trust pieces, how do you regulate machine learning? And there's a lot of talk around this, right? You want to make sure that you regulate machine learning a point where, yes, we're taking care of civil liberties, citizen rights, and everything around it. At the same time, continuing to foster innovation, making sure that you are able to drive better and faster products, faster solution sets, uh, while you continue to keep your eye on civil rights, right? So with that, make that dialogue continuing. So dialogue with, Jibu, yourself, NASCOM bodies, with the government, with various industry stakeholders, with the academy, policymakers. You bring in all of that perspective before you put out a solution, because then that has a better acceptability. It is possibly out of bias. It is, people know how to use it, and more importantly, people are able to not even sometimes realize that it is there, right? So that's where we want to get to that point where ML is there everywhere, but you no longer say, well, this is a machine learning product. You just take it as a way of life.
I think you made some very important point, which I seldom hear when we talk about AI and ML. For example, the diversity and the need to have the responsible AI elements. Right, I myself is a founding editorial board member of Springer's AI and Ethics Journal. So we look into this how we need to incorporate multicultural elements, all these things there, in order to avoid bias and things like that. And one important thing is, like you said about benchmarking. Are you? I mean, there are many initiatives going on. I mean, especially in US and all, it's growing fastly. The whole movement to have algorithmic auditing, and you mentioned about regulating. So, do you believe we need a framework where you can incorporate these things, or do you believe we will have a somehow we will figure out a system where we don't need a rigid framework, but I can have a sort of understanding, based on the the principles that every organization has in place.
So, like I indicated, right, just to be when I was closing it, I think it's important for us to just know that while there are civil rights and citizen rights that could come in, there are ways that are go and no-go areas for machine learning, and everybody appreciates that, right? At what point does it become destructive, and at what point it is constructive? So I think a lot of people get that piece. So there has to be a balance between when do you have over-regulation, which causes, obviously stifling of innovation, and at the same time you have under regulation, and then there is a bit of havoc. So there is what we call as responsible AI, which would go into the realm of, hey, can we actually have a dialogue with multiple stakeholders? Can we make sure that the solutions that are put out there are scrubbed of bias? Therefore, it has diverse backgrounds coming in, supporting it, diverse backgrounds actually going in and testing it, and then appropriately deployed. And in case there are any aberrations, any outliers that come as part of the deployment, then can we reiterate that? Can we actually go ahead and immediately take course correction around it? So building those checks and balances around it, and at the overall, we make sure that you're continuing to innovate responsibly. That's, I think, the fundamental theme. And if that was actually the whole
yes
we did with 2020, right, earlier this year.
Yes, I know I have so many questions to ask, but you keep giving very insightful answers. But I'm sure you have a very tight schedule, and I completely agree. One point that you how do I say, you a strong point that I sounded very like resounded in my head was the point you said. We don't need AI and ML everywhere, right? That whole approach to how do I say, automate everything or add this AI ML for the sake of it, or sometimes you going surpassing our own intuition to trust fellow humans. For example, I don't know if you're aware of the whole fiasco happened in UK, where the A-level exams were happening, and they, instead of because of COVID, you can't have an exam in the classroom. So what the authorities thought was, what, we will use an algorithm to figure out the grades for the students instead of taking the assessment from the teachers. And what happened was, one of the factors, one of the parameters algorithm used was a school's previous ranking in last few years, which meant good students from bad schools ended up getting lower scores, and bad students from, let's say, rich upper class areas, they get higher scores. So it has created a lot of confusion, a lot of uproar, and and these kind of things actually leads to sort of a mistrust in AI. But like you pointed out, it's about identifying the right problems and figuring out why, figuring out the path rather than going a crazy AI everywhere. It was nice talking to you, Kanishka. It was very insightful, and I completely agree with many of the points you said. And I think we have a long way to go still. We are still in a nascent state, in terms of research, and many new developments happening. And especially your organization has been one of the pioneers in making, not just democratizing AI, as well as in terms of innovation also. So I wish you all the best, and I hope to see more from you, and expecting to hear more from you in your famous talks, and other avenues as well. So I'm very happy to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jibo. Thank you. And thanks to the NASCOM team on this. Thank you, guys.